If you think about the way United Artists was started, it was about artists coming together and saying, here's a place for you to work and we'll distribute the movies.
Yeah.
And I was having a conversation with somebody who was trying to build a studio somewhere. And I said, we never owned studios, United Artists. We didn't own a studio. We rented, So it wasn't the physical aspect of it.
Yeah.
What we did was we encouraged filmmakers, to have a vision and to have their own vision, and then supported them in their vision. And if we had a question or if we had something to say, we would say it in a way that it wasn't like, hey, we're the filmmaker. You're just an employee. The answer is that's not the case. You protect the artist and you protect their vision, and sometimes they don't have a vision. They're going into this just trying to figure it out. Yeah. And that's okay too.
Guest today, Mike Medavoy, is one of the real giants in film history in the United States. He was an agent, and then he co-founded Orion Pictures and produced over 300 films, 100 of which I think got nominated for Academy Awards. Some of the greatest films of all time, still to this day.
Which ones?
Well, let's see. He was responsible for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Rocky, Annie Hall. Those all won Academy Awards. He produced Apocalypse Now, Raging Bull, Network, Coming Home, Platoon, Amadeus, RoboCop, Hannah and Her Sisters, The Terminator, Dances with the Wolves, and Silence of the Lambs, just to name a few. But there are many, many others, and people should go out and look at kind of the history of his work and then watch his films. It's unbelievable what he did, what he was able to accomplish.
So, Mike, we just started talking because of Marlon.
First of all, for the audience, we're talking about Marlon Brando. I mean, not everybody knows. In generations now, we're talking about one of the most extraordinary actors of all time. So Marlon Brando is who we're talking about.
How did you meet Marlon?
I was at United Artists, right? And we did 2 films with Marlon that I can remember. There's so many films now that. One of them was Missouri Breaks, and the other one was Apocalypse Now.
Right.
And then we became friends. Actually, I think the time that we connected was when I went to Sean Penn's wedding.
Right.
And there he was. He was hilarious. I think he was trying to take Jack Nicholson and Warren Beatty's pants off as they were all talking.
Now, wait. Was he trying to take both pants off at the same time, or what was going on?
Yeah. They were all up on the stage. It was a funny moment. And then, we spent time talking about various things. He was an extraordinary guy. He had a lot of interests in so many different areas. And the ones that he was always ahead of his time. He was on the Selma March. He was protecting the American Indians. He, used to take people to his island. Some of the blacks who had problems.
Did you go to his island?
Yeah, no, I've been to the island a lot. As a matter of fact, we built a hotel there, which is great. I mean, it's Obama wrote his book there, and it's now become infamous. It's a great place because it's very protected. There, nobody uses cameras there. Certainly none of the people that work there put photos up. And it kind of reminded me of what Marlon said to me earlier about the island. He said it's the one place you can go that, first of all, nobody cares who you are.
Right.
And in most instances, they don't know who you are. And the island is completely an eco resort. It's great. It's if you want to get away, this is the place.
How much did he change between Missouri Breaks and Apocalypse Now? Did you sense a difference in him between those 2 movies?
Well, he gained weight, if that's one of the questions.
Not about the weight, really, more just about, because in Missouri Breaks, he's not as loose as an actor as he is in, maybe he's doing that intentionally, but Apocalypse Now, he's like a otherworldly character, what he's doing, Well,
the whole Apocalypse Now thing is a very interesting discussion, and probably Francis needs to be here to correct it. I've had conversations with people who were, I went to the Philippines when we were shooting that movie. He arrived, heavier, but not so heavy that he was unrecognizable. And this whole thing about shooting him from the head up in the dark, he did, stop the production for a while. He had read the book, he had read the script and had ideas. There's nothing wrong with that.
You've worked on so many great movies, right? From Martin Scorsese's movies to Francis Coppola's movies to Woody Allen movies. How did you recognize
Milos Forman's movies?
Oh yeah, that's an incredible movie.
There, 5 of those.
Yeah, wow. I mean, how did you recognize a director, or how do you recognize a script? What does it take to know? Because now you look back, all those were like seminal directors, but I mean, at the time, did you already know that they were seminal directors? Like, how did you recognize that talent, and then how do you work with them on the scripts?
Well, it was interesting because, if you look at my career, I started off in the mailroom at Universal Studios.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose there's some traditional story to that, but then I became an agent, and I was in a small agency at first, and that agency only represented actors, and they were mostly, old time actors like Keenan Wynn and, people like that, Van Heflin. But they had one young guy there, and his name was Tony Bell. And Tony said to me when I switched to a bigger agency, he said, you ought to represent directors. I mean, that's a better way to go. I started signing young people because, I didn't have the connections to do anything else. And I wound up with a whole, raft of them because nobody, who else was I wasn't going to get any of the established directors. So I ended up with Spielberg and Coppola and Lucas and Malick and Milius and, there was a raft of them. Soon
Right. But they were still relatively new. So how did, what were you recognizing? Had they made things yet? Or, how were you?
Well, I saw Spielberg's first movie,
Is that Duel?
No, it was Amblin.
Oh, right. Okay.
Milius and George had done a short that I saw at USC called Marcello, I'm So Bored. But I was interested in his writing more than I was in his directing. But, I had an eye for talent, if that's, possible.
Yeah.
And people would introduce me to people. That's usually what happens. People say, hey, that guy's really talented. You should see him. And I would seize on it, whether it's, Crichton was another one of those that came along in my life. Ashby, there were people that I recognized were talented. I was, in effect, really as an agent, you're kind of a middleman.
Right.
But what was interesting is that one of the things I learned at the agency that I was at, which was CMA, was how to put movies together. How to get a director, a really good idea, a good script. Then that propelled me to becoming the head of a production at United Artists.
And these are such different talents, different kinds of talents. Like Hal Ashby is one whole, sort of idea of movie making. Spielberg's a different idea. I mean, how do those all exist in the same place?
Well, when you go to the movies, there's, there are all kinds of movies that get made.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading something today about somebody who said, I don't want to do any passion pictures. I just want to do pictures that make money or whatever. I thought it was a pretty stupid thing. You work out of passion.
Yeah.
Your work ought to represent what you really believe in. Now, it doesn't always work. I've been involved with 325 movies, out of which about 100 are really, I think, great for me anyway. They may not be great for everybody else. And about 100 that are in the middle, and 100 that are, somebody should have shot me if I, thought that was good.
So when you go from being an agent representing these incredible directors, which by the way, it was such a time, and then it feels like there wasn't that time until years later. There was another heyday of these sort of auteurs, but everyone that you have referenced so far, for the audience, go look all these people up because they're remarkable. They all had this distinct voice, and they're very different, as Jesse said. They're all different from each other, but they were auteurs, they were visionary, right? And so how do you go from that to then you at some point you said, I'm going to co-found Orion Pictures. Like what do you want to do then with all of this? Like what's driving you to keep going forward into creating your own sort of world to keep doing this work?
Well, I love storytelling generally, and visual storytelling is even better, right? I was a history major in college, and I have this kind of, well, I don't know about eclectic, but I have this life that's probably quite different than most people. I'm born in China. I'm a Russian Jew. Lived in Chile for 10 years, so I speak other languages. My whole life has been kind of interesting, and it's kind of interesting because recently, Matter of fact, 2 weeks ago, they basically erected a statue to my family at the Jewish Holocaust Museum in Shanghai.
Mm.
And they sent me a picture of it. And I thought, well, that's the full money. That's the full circle of my life. Because I'm looking at it now. It's got a picture of my mother, my father, myself, and my sister leaving Shanghai in 1948. So that kind of expanded version of your life, allows me to kind of look at everything, to try to figure it out. I went to Alan Ladd's memorial the other day, and I was really interested because he did some really terrific work. And, it's been clear to me that, when I wrote my book, the first book that I wrote, You're Only As Good As Your Next One, it was kind of a look at the business at the time. But now I look at it a little different. It wasn't about me. It's not about me. It's about the work itself.
Yeah.
Cuckoo's Nest. Do you remember reading Cuckoo's Nest the first time, and what did you make of it when you just looked at it on paper?
Well, it's a pretty good story. If I have the time, I'm not right now. I'll just tell you. 1973, I think, or probably four. I got a call from the guy that owned the agency. I was running the motion picture department. And he said, Kirk Douglas is looking for an agent. I said, I really don't want to represent Kirk Douglas. I don't want to stay up late at night having been tortured at the office. And I finally agreed to go meet Kirk, and I went to see him. And it was terrific. He was really smart and, had an interesting thing to say. And I thought, well, why not? So
where did you meet him, Mike? Do you remember where you met him?
I met him at his house. I think it was on Crescent or one of those in Beverly Hills.
Yeah.
And I waited for about 2 weeks. I didn't hear from him. I figured he was going to another agency, and which, by the way, he was. But he said, but you can represent a project that I did off Broadway called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I'll star in it. And I thought, thanks a lot. You're too old to star in this part. I didn't say that, but I thought that. At any rate, he said, you know what? You're too smart to be an agent. You're going to leave and become the head of a studio. And I thought, he's being very nice. It's a great way to, let me down.
Yeah.
And sure enough, 6 months later, I was going to United Artists. Now, 6 months into my job, I don't think I'd started a movie. There was something there, and I started that. But other than that, and I get a phone call from Arthur Krim, who was then chairman of United Artists, and maybe one of the brightest guys I've met in show business for sure, and maybe in any other business. But he called me up and he said, I need you to come to New York. And I thought, wow, I probably lost my job 6 months into it, and I've given up all my clients. And at that time I had like 42 clients.
Right.
People like Gene Wilder. And so I sat in front of Arthur, and Arthur said, what the hell are you doing out there? I said, well, I'm trying to find movies and I can't find anything I want to do. And he said, you know how many people work in this building? I said, no. He said, 329 people. And they are all going to lose their job because you can't start movies. He said, go get a movie started. I said, well, I'll leave tomorrow and I'll see if I can find something. He said, tomorrow, leave tonight. So I got on a plane, went home, got up in the morning, got into my office, and there was a script on my desk, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I read the script, I called him up, and I said, okay, here's one I want to do. Let's do it. Part of the investment was in because Saul Zaentz, who was a terrific producer and had produced these movies, some of Milish's movies, as a matter of fact, was producing it. And at one point, Hal Ashby was supposed to direct it. And I'm sure that's when Jack got into it. And Michael Douglas, by the way, was producing it. So, right. And he had gotten rid of his father as an actor. So I no longer had that problem to deal with. And that's basically how it all happened.
But I have a question. Did you love the script, or was it that
No, it was terrific.
Howard had said you better get something going?
Yeah, no, it was a terrific script. It was,
okay. Right.
And of course, it went on to win the Academy Award, and it got the proverbial 5 top categories won the award, which was great because it's I've been involved in 2 of those movies that have won 5, and there are actually 3.
What were the others? What are the other two?
The other one, I think Silence of the Lambs, I think won 5. And there was one done, I can't remember, one other one done that had 5.
When you're reading a script, usually is there a director attached? Are you just seeing the whole vision? What is it about, all of these films are just iconic, extraordinary. I mean, there's not even words for them. So is it just that, is it a feeling? What is it? Can you see it? And is it about expanding your worldview? Because you have you referenced your growing up and had such an interesting story, traveling around the world. Are these big stories that take us somewhere else? Like, what is it what are you attracted to in a lot of these? Because they're just so big.
There are a lot of things, right? That I think that there was 5 things that we always looked at when we determined whether to make a movie or not: the script, the director, the principal members of the cast, the budget. I don't say that's a commercial movie. I can actually edit to say nobody's going to go see that movie. I can do that. Right. I can't say, hey, that's a commercial movie. I don't think anybody knows that.
Mm-hmm.
They can guess at it, but I don't think about whether it's commercial or not commercial. I can think, hey, nobody will go see it, or it won't find an audience. That's fairly easy.
When you were working with Gene Wilder, was that Young Frankenstein?
Yeah.
For him, those movies that it's such an unusual talent. I mean, you're working with Jack Nicholson, you're friends with Marlon Brando. I mean, what did you recognize in Gene Wilder that was so, he was like a genius, but it was like, what was it?
He was unique. The movies that he did, he was obviously very funny. And he plays it straight and then he, flips it. The way I wound up representing him was really funny because I ran into him in a clothing store in Beverly Hills. And I said, I'd love to represent you. Are you represented by anybody? He said, well, I have this agent in New York. I said, well, if you ever decide you want to move, I'd love to represent you. I said, I think you should write and direct. He was taken by it. And then one day he called me and said, I can't give up my agent in New York. Can you make a deal with her that we can share? And I said, well, I don't think the agency will allow me to do that, but I will consider doing that. And I came to New York and I met with his then agent and we split the commission. And then one day I was sitting in my office. I had just had lunch with Michael Gruskoff, who used to work with me at CMA. And I was trying to, induce him to come back to work as an agent. And by then he had produced a movie or 2. And he said, I really don't want to do that. And I said, well, if you're really just going to produce, let me give you something that I read that a client of mine, Gene Wilder, has given me. It's called Young Frankenstein. And then I called Gene up in New York and I said, are you finished with the script? He said, well, I'm doing it now. I said, okay, I have a couple of clients that I'd like you to write parts for. And they were both in my office, Peter Boyle and Marty Feldman.
Right.
And I thought actually in my head, it was kind of stupid, but funny. These guys can actually play the, Three Stooges. Right. So I introduced him on the phone. Everybody said hello. And then Marty finished the script. I gave it to Gruskoff. We made a deal at Columbia. And then Columbia, the real story, because I heard Mel's version of it the other day. The real story is that Columbia was willing to go to $2 million to make the movie.
Right.
And then he said black and white. And they said, well, oh, no, we don't want to do it black and white.
Right.
And so Gruskoff took it to Alan Ladd, and then Alan Ladd made the movie. It was kind of a strange year that year for me because I had 3 movies that I put together. One was The Sting.
Right.
And
which also won an Academy Award. Yeah.
Right. And then Jaws,
yeah.
As I represented the right, that's got another funny story attached to it. But it was like everything was working, for me. So, it was an interesting period. There was also, everything was changing. The Vietnam War had certainly changed a lot.
Mike, you said the Vietnam War was really impacting, obviously coming home, which I think you also did.
Yeah.
But how was it changing kind of what the appetite was or what you were interested in stories that you started to tell?
Well, I was less into making the statement about the war than most people were, and for lots of reasons. One of which was At the time, I was in the Army. I had just become an American citizen. I believed in America, and if you're in the Army, you don't go out against the war unless you want to make a lot of waves that drown you.
Mm-hmm.
So I got less involved with the war. It hit me in the face, but I didn't react to it.
Coming Home is kind of an unusual movie to make as coming out of the Army. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, that's Jane Fonda, really. I mean, it was her passion that did two things: got the movie made, with Jerry Hellman was the producer at the time, and Hal, who had been a client of mine. We had done a movie before with Hal, which I really liked, that didn't do that well, but I still like the movie, which is the Woody Guthrie story, Bound for Glory.
Yeah, that's a good movie. Yeah,
I really like that movie. I mean, it's at any rate, there were some disagreements about casting, but other than that, once we said, okay, go make the movie, Hal and everybody went out and made it. I had a problem with making the movie because Jane, who had been a client while this movie was being developed, had somebody who worked with her who claimed that it was her idea. And I knew that this was going to be a lawsuit of some sort.
Right.
So I was trying to avoid getting in the middle of this, since as a result of representing Jane, I also represented her. I can't remember her name now. But, the movie got made, and we wound up doing 3 Vietnam War movies: Apocalypse, Platoon, and Coming Home.
Wow. It's interesting because it's like Coming Home's made right after the war, Apocalypse is made a period on, and then Platoon is even further on, and sort of the vision of the war changes through those movies in a sense.
And the impact on the public changes too, because people are coming from a different place.
Yeah, and what were your thoughts on that? Because if right at the end of the war, it's a black and white issue. By the time you get to Platoon, the fighting within the platoon itself, it's like a very different portrayal.
Well, the thing that I found about Platoon, when the first time I saw it, I was just blown away by the movie for lots of reasons. First of all, having been in the Army, I'm glad that I avoided having to go to Vietnam, but I was in the reserves and not in the regular Army. I was, believe it or not, I was a radio and television newscaster in the Army. So I was sent to Korea, and there I was on AFKN, Armed Forces Korean Network. I was sent to Panama, Southern Command Network. And I never saw any combat except, there was training. That's about it. Right. But the reality of Platoon really gripped me. I mean, it also reminded me that I got lucky that I didn't wind up going.
This period, where you have those 3 movies and everything is happening. Has Hollywood in a sense changed, because it seems like you could be a maverick, you can make the movie you want to make. And now it's almost like the streaming thing has become a very different thing. Have you seen the way that movies are made and sort of the spirit of Hollywood change over time?
Well, I don't know how other people worked. I mean, I know that some movies made by others are just as great as anything I might have done or did. I think that the streaming thing, there's so much of it. There's so much material out there. And it's, often I think that people judge what to make or not to make based on not what their convictions are about something that ought to be done. I mean, I'd be really interested to see if somebody's going to do something on the war between the Russians and the Ukrainians, which has some involvement with us, but not directly. But, I sit here often think about, okay, well, how can you capture that moment? Or how can you, I can think of a lot of things that have been happening in America that ought to be captured in some sort of film. But film is about characters, and their journey. And so I have to think about that. How do I do that? And I'm still working. I still find interesting things to do. I like the documentary stuff that gets done. I like working with interesting people. My life is more than just making movies. That's the other thing. My life has always been about a broader picture. I'm on like 4 think tanks, that are all foreign policy based.
How would a movie like Philadelphia get made now? And like, where does it start for you? Like a movie like that, which is, like you say, a movie that should be made, like that's a movie that should be made. but it's like, how hard was it to get that made? And
I was, here's the thing, right? At the time I was at TriStar. The movie had been developed actually at Orion, but by then Orion was out of business. And Mark Platt, who used to work for me, brought it over, and I had to go, through a lot to get that movie made. Less with Goober than with John Dolgen, who was then a total impediment in anything I was doing. But I wasn't going to give up, and I had the right to green light a movie under a budget number, so I just decided I was going to make it.
Did you put Tom Hanks in there to kind of ease or was he already attached?
Tom, I think Jonathan brought Tom in, but I think the real beauty of that movie was casting Denzel.
Yeah.
And that was Jonathan's idea. And when he told me the idea, I thought, God, is that brilliant, right? I mean, that was really, I think in a lot of ways that made that movie.
Yeah, that relationship wasn't,
Yeah.
And like, how hard is it to get a movie like that made? Like, even if you have the ability to greenlight it, like, you say, well, I had impediments. Does every movie have impediments? Is there a way to get it made,
Yeah, unless it's got a movie star, that people believe that they'll open the movie minimum. Everything is got something, that somebody doesn't want to do. But, a really good director often, can do that.
Now, does Amadeus because Amadeus seems like it's a very, as an outsider, first off, it's an incredible movie. Won, Academy Awards. It looks like it's an expensive movie, and you're going to talk about like I've got a great idea for a movie. It's going to be about Mozart. It's not exactly like people go like, oh my God, that's box office gold, right? So how do you?
Yeah, the thing that was interesting about that movie, was Milos Forman, who, by the way, had done an Academy Award movie with us already.
Yeah,
it was a play.
Yeah.
First, right, and it was readapted by Milos. Shot in Czechoslovakia. The only thing that I had a question about was the casting. And I thought, man, I mean, that doesn't sound like Mozart.
Tom Hulce?
Yeah, Tom Hulce.
Yeah.
And I doubted it, I must admit, but it was brilliant.
Yeah.
And did Milos just see that and say, yes, this is the guy?
Yeah.
Mike, you started as representing the talent, and then you go and you're overseeing the films. How important was it for you in running these studios to really let the directors do their thing? Like, how much did you just sort of protect them and their vision? Because it seems like you're really about their vision.
That was it. That was that. And that was what United Artists was. If you think about the way United Artists was started, it was about artists coming together and saying, here's a place for you to work and we'll distribute the movies. And I was having a conversation with somebody who was trying to build a studio somewhere. And I said, we never owned studios, United Artists. We didn't own a studio. We rented, So it wasn't the physical aspect of it.
Yeah.
What we did was we encouraged filmmakers, to have a vision and to have their own vision, and then supported them in their vision. And if we had a question or if we had something to say, we would say it in a way that it wasn't like, hey, we're the filmmaker. You're just an employee. The answer is that's not the case. You protect the artist and you protect their vision. That's why I say it's not about me. It's about these people that are making it.
Dances with Wolves. Did you recognize the script right away? I think he was a first-time screenwriter at that time.
It was a script and a book, Mike?
Yes.
Was it a book?
It was
script,
really,
and he couldn't get it made, and so then
actually, I was with Kevin Costner this weekend, and we didn't talk about this, but he was turned down by everybody, and sold some of the foreign rights. He had a vision. He made his vision.
Yeah. He
Great.
seems like that his vision's been incredibly consistent, on that show that he's on now. It's almost an extension of that same character,
Yeah.
It has a vision of the American experience, I think, in some sense.
We did 3 movies together, all of which I like. No Way Out, which I thought was a really good movie.
Yeah, that was probably the first one. Yeah,
that was the first one I did with him.
Yeah. Boy, the twist on that was a remake, right?
Yes, it was. It was a Universal movie. The producer brought it to us, and that was our first movie with Kevin.
What was when then you did two more?
We did a baseball movie.
Field of Dreams.
No.
wait, which one was it? It was I know this movie. He's a catcher. He plays a catcher.
Yes,
Yes, I forget the name of the movie, but yeah,
yes, me too, and I can look it up.
Oh my
but-
God.
yeah, and you made it.
Yes,
Okay, and then Dances with Wolves. We'll post what that second movie.
Yeah,
Don't get
yeah.
mad, Mr. Costner. We'll post
Yeah.
it. We can't let you. We need to circle back though. You said there was a funny story about Jaws. What was that funny story about Jaws?
well, I had the book. I brought it to Zanuck and Brown because I'd done the sting with them, and I said, "Look, I'll sell you the book, but you've got to put one of my directors on it, and here's the list."
Yeah.
And they picked a director, and I won't say who it was, but Dick went to New York to meet with the author and took the director with him. And the director kept referring to Jaws as the whale. And he would say, the whale does this and the whale does that. And at the end of it, I was in London, and I got this phone call from Dick, and he said, "Hey, I can't make this movie with this guy. And you got to, you got an author you have to represent."
Yeah.
Right.
And I said, "Well, who are you thinking of?" And he said, "Spielberg." I said, "Okay. I mean, you just made a movie with him that didn't work, but go ahead."
Yeah.
So that's how it happened.
And you ruined everybody's lives because I can't go back and swim in the ocean ever again. I can't even go in the swimming pool. I hear the music. I feel like
When I'm off this call, I'm about to go to a music session with that in mind.
Did you do you remember when you first saw the movie, the first screening?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of what it was. I mean, it was such a huge hit, right?
Yeah. But I mean, was it
And
from the first screening?
the kind of the book. I mean, I didn't get the director I wanted on my list, and it was Steven who, actually I had basically told him to get another agent for something that had happened that I don't want to talk about, but it's one of those great films, that people remember, especially the music.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now, do you get that same feeling when you do Silence of the Lambs? Do you know that's a hit before you even do anything?
No, that one I didn't know was going to be a hit the way it was. I did cry at Philadelphia.
Yeah. Yeah.
The ending of Philadelphia.
Yeah. That's a very special movie.
Wow. Is there anything before we let you go, because it sounds like you've got stuff to do. I know you're busy, but anything you're excited about right now that's out there, or young film? I mean, you did work obviously with Darren Aronofsky, and I'm sure a lot of people now. But is there anything that's exciting you right now that you see out there? Or is there still the same? Are there always going to be these emerging voices? And is there anybody that strikes you now? If you were still that agent going after somebody, who would you want to sign right now?
There aren't that many people. There never was that many people. I mean, the thing that was interesting, is I had a lot of English directors that I represented, like Lindsay Anderson and Carol Rice, Tony Richardson. Some Italians. I became really good friends with Truffaut. There were voices, at that time that were really important to me. Now, 325 movies later, what is it that I'm going to do? I'm working on a book, basically about my family, because I was trying to figure out if I could answer the question is, how did it all happen?
Yeah.
How did it all wind up here?
Yeah.
I mean, I can think about other people's lives and understand it, but trying to dig into your own is really an interesting journey.
Yeah.
I think now there are some interesting voices out there. There's so much going on there that I'm not as wired in, I think this guy, there are a couple of people. The guy who did Dune, I think has got a nice, good voice. I like Coda, and I think, that's the only film I've seen that she's done, but it's pretty good. Taiki Waititi, is that his name? The New Zealander. I think he's interesting. What I find interesting, it's easier for me now because I've done all of this, right? People think that I know what I'm doing. Actually, I know how to be a good partner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And protect your talent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Protect the vision.
And get their vision.
Yeah.
And sometimes they don't have a vision. They're going into this trying to figure it out. And that's okay too. there's so much coincidences of life, right? For all of us. I mean, how did we end up where we are? How did I end up being Marlon Brando's executor?
Yeah.
How did all this stuff happen? There's a certain number of coincidences, even, to our birth, if you will. Those questions belong to your, while you're alive.
Mhm.
Because when you're dead, I'm sure there'll be lots of people that will define you. And this is a very difficult business to be in. And the time has changed so drastically because everything is, on your phone or your computer, and there's so much misinformation about our lives.
Yeah.
And assumptions and presumptions of who you are and what you are, and people who don't want to give you credit for anything. You didn't do that, I did it, or, I mean, frankly, I could give less of a shit whether, what you think, I know what my contribution is and I don't try to inflate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Mike, thank you so much for doing this with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, I hope it all works.
Just such a pleasure, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. I'll be around.
Okay.
We'll see you guys. Yep.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay. Bye, guys.
Bye.